Welcome back to IV Tutor. We are looking at classes, and we want to continue from our previous discussion on the basics of classes and talk about, how to use your classes and how to overload your operators, because this is also another section where I've seen most of you struggling just to understand what's really going on. So we're going to just talk about the basics, discuss the way your questions are usually structured, and then we can look at a few classes examples after this one, right? So we're just going to carry on from our, day of year example that we've been looking at under class basics. So if you haven't watched that video, please go and do that. And basically, we've got this class here, day of year, which represents a day of the year. And when it comes to operator overloading, right? Usually it's because of what we want to do in the main function here, which is where we want to use our day of years. For example, let's say we've got our class, it's fully implemented and it works. And then, as part of our logic, we want to compare 2 days. We've got day of year D1 and day of year D2. And we want to compare if D2 is greater than D1. Now, the challenge that you face is this. You cannot use the greater than sign with variables of type day of year. You just want to know how to handle them, because it's not like an integer. So your greater than operator here cannot compare variables of type day of year. But it would be awesome if we could, tell this guy how to compare, objects of type day of year, because then we can just write our code like this. Instead of doing something like if D2.getYear is greater than D1.getYear and D1.day and put a whole bunch of logic, we could just put that logic and tell this operator here how to handle variables of type day of year, like how should they be compared? And then we can just do this. Another instance is, what if we want the user to provide the day and year, the day and month, and we just want to put that straight into a variable of type day of year, like this. You can do cin with a variable of type int, which works, but you cannot do this because, how does the extraction operator doesn't know how to use an input stream and an object of type day of year, because it just wouldn't know what to do here. But we can overload this operator and tell it exactly what it should do. Like, okay, extract the first item and put in day, extract the second item and put in month. If we can achieve that, it means our code becomes simpler, because then we can just cin straight into a D1, into an object of type day of year. And likewise, what if we want to display a day of year? What if we want to just go cout D1 and display the day space month? But if we just do this like this, your compiler would say, error, because this insertion or stream insertion operator does not know how to handle an output stream together with a variable of type day of year. If it's a string, it's happy. If it's an integer, it's happy. If it's a double, it's happy. But if it's this, then it doesn't know, because this is your class. You created this. But these operators can be overloaded so that you can then use them with objects of type day of year. That is the idea behind overloading operators. It makes your code simpler because you teach or you overload your operators, and then you can just use them with objects of type day of year or whichever class you are using, right? And when it comes to overloading operators, I want you to understand that an operator is just a function. Honestly, it's just a function. Like, there's nothing special. It's a normal function. The same way you've done all the other functions like these ones, operators are also functions. But what makes them special is that the name of the function is plus. For example, a plus operator. It's a function which takes 2 arguments. For example, integers. It adds them together and it returns a new total, which means the actual function that you use when you want to overload the plus operator is you just go operator and then you say plus. Otherwise, this is a function which takes 2 arguments, maybe an integer x and an integer y, and it returns an integer if it's integers. In other words, we can say, the operator plus takes 2 arguments that you want to add, and it returns an instance of that same argument. So we can actually overload this operator and allow it to add two objects of type day of year, which means we can say, well, it should return a day of year, right? And operator plus, and it should take two arguments of type day of year. So you can say day of year here, give it the first argument, and day of year here, and give it the second argument. And then we can define inside this function what it should do if it's given two objects of type day of year. We can then define the logic here. So these operators are actually functions. And speaking of functions, they can be basically grouped into two types of functions. We've got what we refer to as binary functions, and then we've got unary functions. And this is based on the fact that binary, they take two arguments. For example, the plus takes two arguments. The division, okay, let's just go plus, division, multiplication, subtraction. These all take two arguments. Or another one is the greater than sign. It takes two arguments. The less than, greater or equal, less or equal. These are all functions which take two arguments. So therefore, they are referred to as binary functions. Or the stream extraction operator or the stream insertion operator. These are all functions which take two arguments. Unary operators take only one argument, like the plus operator. Like you can do a plus to increment a value, or the minus, or the plus equals, or the plus multiplication. Multiplication equals. These are all unary. No, these are binary. Sorry, these are binary. Plus, minus are examples of unary operators because these only take one argument. Like when you use them, you just give it one argument and it increments this value. So, but otherwise, your operators are just normal functions. And what we want to do in this case is learn how to overload these operators so that we can use them with anything. With our class, we can overload these guys, we can overload these guys, we can overload these guys. So we can actually overload any operator. Now, when overloading operators, I want you to fully understand that there are two ways to overload these operators. You can overload the operator as a member function, but in most cases, you overload these operators as friend functions, right? A friend function is not a member function of your class. In other words, it's not part of the class, okay? It's simply a function that you're giving the privilege to access all your member variables in the class, which are private. Because remember, everything private cannot be accessed outside the class. So if you have a function somewhere that receives a variable of type day of year, it cannot access everything under private. But you can make that function a friend of your class, which means it gives it access to everything that is under private. And we'll see this in a moment when we start overloading our operators. So we'll definitely see how it works. So let's say, for instance, we want to overload our stream extraction and stream insertion operators with for our day of year class, okay? Which one is the stream extraction and which one is the stream insertion operator? So if you go C in X, this is an input stream. This is your variable. Or you can go C out, then you go X. This is your stream, this is your variable. The stream operator points in the direction of data flow. So in this case, it's moving from your stream to your X. I think I've said this in the previous videos that you must have watched. I think it's the file streams video. So data is moving from your input stream into your variable. And here, data is moving from your variable into your input stream. Therefore, this is the stream extraction because it's extracting from your stream into a variable. This is the insertion because it's inserting into your stream, which then displays on the screen, for instance. And we said, look, there are different types of input streams. For example, we've got file input streams and file output streams, but they are all the same. They work exactly the same. So we want to overload these operators so that we can see in a day of year variable and see out a day of year variable, for instance. And you can overload any operator that you want. So we can maybe also play around and overload this operator as well. Or we can overload the equality operator as well, which is this guy. Let's maybe just for fun overload this one as well, which is what we want to use to compare two variables of type day of year. So where does operator overloading really happen? So what I'm saying is, when you start using your class, okay, I'm going to do this in code blocks so that I can move with you very slowly. Let's say you are in your main function, right? And you make your variables of type day of year, D. Let's just call this one D or day, right? And let's say we make another one day of year. Let's call this one holiday. Use a holiday, right? We want to be able to say if day is equal to holiday, and then do something if these are equal or not. But again, we cannot really use this operator here because it doesn't know how to handle objects or variables of type day of year. Okay, so what do you then do? Let's just make sure that I'm sharing the right. Okay, yeah, that's fine. So to overload this operator, you can simply add a function here. In the exam, they just want you to do the function, but I want to do this because I want to show you where it happens. It doesn't happen in the class. It happens where your main function is, because this function is not part of the class. Now, if we think about the equality operator, it returns a Boolean, true, false, which means the return value or the return type is a Boolean. The function name, operator, pay. So every time you overload an operator, you have to put the keyword operator behind your actual operator. And then we can now say we want these to take two arguments of type day of year. So we can now go, the first argument is day of year. And always when you overload the operators, you pass in your arguments as by reference. Just do it by reference all the time. It will save you some trouble. So let's call this one D1. And let's pass in another one by reference. And let's call this one D2, like that. That's our function. And we can then say, well, how do we want to compare two variables of type day of year? We can then say, well, if D1.day, for example, is equal to D2.day and D1.year, or month, sorry, is equal to D2.month, then let's return true. We can say, well, these are equal. Otherwise, we just return false. So we are saying this is how the equality operator should compare objects of type day of year. But there's a problem here. And if you can see this problem, it means you are following. Day is private and month is private, which means we cannot use day and month here. We have to use get day and get month. So we have to go D1 dot get day and D2 dot get day, D1 dot get month, and so forth. But you can agree with me that, well, it's actually simpler if we can just access day from here. Our code looks clean, it looks simpler. So one of the most common practices is whenever you overload your operators, you want this function to have access to everything private in your class so that it's easier to implement it. And to do that, this function must then be made a friend of your class, which is what gives it access to everything under private as long as it's a class day of year. So to make it a friend function, so let me repeat. The actual function is not part of the class, but what we want to do is want it to have the privileges of accessing everything under private so that our code looks clean, it looks simpler because we can just directly access everything under private in the class. So you take this function, I'm going to just copy here, and you put this in your class as a friend function. So you just put the function in your class as it is, nothing changes. There's a semicolon because now it's just a declaration, and you put the keyword friend behind it. That is how you make it a friend of the class. Okay, so the way you overload these operators, you have to think about it a little bit. Like, okay, what is this operator doing and what does it return? Like if it's this here, we know that it returns a Boolean because it's saying are they equal or not. So it returns a Boolean. If we were doing this operator here, again, it returns a Boolean because we know that it's going to take two arguments of day of year, it's going to compare them and say, yes, it's greater or not. But if we were implementing the plus operator, well, if you say 1 plus 2, what do you get? You get a number, you get an integer, which means this operator returns a day of year. It returns whatever instance you are trying to sum, right? So you have to know like what each operator should return. Like mostly these are the Boolean ones, plus, minus, division, and those ones are they would normally return the same class, because if you add two numbers, the result is still a number, which means if you add two day of year objects, the result should still be a day of year object, which is now a combination of the two, depending on your logic. So that is basically how you then make a function a friend function. And once we have done this, it means in our main function, we are now allowed to do this. And if we do this, it simply means that it's going to compare the day of year, the day and month in these two objects, and give us a true if they're equal and a false if not, according to the logic that we have provided in our implementation. Right? The other two most common functions you must always remember how to implement are your stream extraction and your stream insertion operators. Now, let's start with the stream extraction, the one that you use with cin. So if you want to remember which one it is, think of cin and cout. That's how you easily can remember this is the stream extraction, because the cin one points on your right, the cout one points on your left. And that's the stream insertion. So it might be easier to remember. The special thing with your stream insertion and or stream extraction operators is that they always return a stream. So the stream insertion operator will return an input stream by reference every single time. And then you can go operator, that's your stream extraction, the one that you use with cin to input, right? And your stream extraction or stream insertion operator, the first argument is always the stream, right? If you think of how you use cin, what do you put on the left? You go cin. If you think of cout, what do you put on the left? You put cout. And then the operator, then the variable that you want to insert into, or if it's cout operator, then the thing that you want to display, right? Which means the first argument is always your stream. So in this case, we say the first argument is an input stream, which we put by reference. I can call this one ins. The second argument is then your class, because you want to be able to do something like cin, for example, cin day, which means the first argument is your input stream. It doesn't matter which one it is. It can be cin, it can be an input file stream, whatever. But you want to be able to say cin, input stream, and then into your day. But how does it do that? So your second argument is then your day of year. I can call this one D. And then you can say, well, if you're given an input stream and a variable of type day of year, what do you want to do? You can then say, well, I want to extract first the day and then the month from the stream, which means if it's cin, it will ask the user to type in the first thing, which is the day. They press enter. It says, okay, the next thing, then they type again, they press enter. And the first item is put in the day. The second item is put in the month. So I can say, well, use your input stream to get the day. So d dot day, right? And then use your stream to also get d dot month. And then your stream operators always return your stream every single time. So that's how it's going to do it, which means if we then use our cin like this, it's going to show the user it will give the user a chance to enter the day according to this, because it's going to be like, yeah, I'm waiting for the day. As soon as the user types in something and press enter, it goes to the next one, which means it waits for you to enter the next thing, just like you do with int x, like you do with integers. Like if you say int x here, or int s, and then you say c in s, your compiler will wait for the user to type something and press enter so that it can put that in here, which means here it will be done twice, right? It will do it twice for the first line, and whatever the user types, that goes into day. And then again for the second line, which is what goes into month. Whatever. If it's a file stream, it's going to read twice into day and again. So it's going to read once into day and then once into month, and then it stops and returns the stream. That's how you implement it. Or another way to implement this, if you want, is you can do this on one line. You can just go input stream, extract d dot day and d dot month. Like you can do this. It follows the same way or the same convention that you do with cin, pretty much. So that's another option if you want to do it that way. And you return your stream. But again, there's a problem because, well, we don't have access to day and we don't have access to month, which means what do we need to do? We make this function a friend, which means we need to make this function a friend of our class, which means here, we then go here, we say friend, and there's our function. And the format for these functions are always the same. The first argument is the stream by reference. The second argument is your class by reference. And in your stream extraction implementation, you're simply extracting from the stream into your member variables. And in the same way, we can also do the stream extraction with the stream insertion operator, which is the one that you use with cout. And in that one, you are saying it returns an output stream, always by reference. You can go operator, then that's for cout, right? And then your first argument is an output stream by reference. Let's call this one out, whatever. And our second argument is day of year, and let's call this one D. It doesn't matter. And what do you want to do? This is where you're saying, well, if I ever go and do something like cout, which is an output stream, and I use the operator, and then I say day, how should it do it? How should it handle, like in this case, how should it display, right? And then you can say, well, the way it should display is according to the way you want to do it. I can say, well, it should go stream, then it should print d.day first, maybe put a comma, space, and then do d.month, and then put a new line at the end. You choose how it should handle an output stream and your variable. And then after this, you can then say return your stream. So which means if you then say cout day, it's going to display the day, comma space, then the month. Or you can say it must say day and then put a colon, and then whatever way you want to do it. So you can say, or maybe it should say, it should say day, colon, and then the day, and then month, colon. Then. So you can choose or decide how this operator should handle an output stream and a day variable. And it will do it according to the way you implement. And again, this should be made a member variable. One other slight variation that you see in this here is sometimes this here is made a constant because the function does not change your day. It's unlike this one where we are actually setting the day and setting the month from the stream. So we cannot make it a constant. But in this case, we can actually make this day of year here a constant, which means that this function does not change this variable. But if it's confusing you, you can start off by not minding the constant thing, get used to everything else, and then you can just remember that for the output stream, you can actually just make this one here a constant. Okay. And this needs to be a friend, which means we go to our class and we say friend, and then there's our function. And it's now a friend. So that is basically how you do your operator overloading functions. And the format for these functions is always the same. You've got your, what is this? Okay, not about the formatting. It's not just picking it up. It has the same consistency. It uses the same format. It's always in the same. It's very consistent. You just have to practice and get used to how it works. Otherwise, the way you overload your operators is normally exactly the same. All right. If we have overloaded our 3 operators like this, okay, it means we are done overloading our operators. Sometimes they only want you to do the class definition and not the implementation. Sometimes they would say, well, do the implementation as well. And I want you to note that whenever you're doing the implementation of your operators, you don't put the class name behind your function like you do with member functions, because these ones are not member functions of your class. You just implement the functions and you don't put the operator overloading stuff. I mean, you don't put the class prefix behind your functions because they are not member functions. You just put the class name, you just put the function name, implement. And I'm doing this because I want you to understand that these functions are implemented together with your main function. They are not part of the class. You can also put these in your CPP file if you want at the bottom. It also works out as long as you don't put the class name prefix here. The other option in terms of overloading these operators is to overload them as member functions, but we are not going to cover that right now. We're just going to do it as friend functions. And once we have done this is where things start to get complicated because your questions are normally in 3 parts. The first part says, do the class definition, which you would have done here. Then they say, implement everything, your member functions and your operators. So you can, if it's in the exam, you just implement everything in one go, right? There's no like, I'm going to do this. It's just going to be one question. You just implement your functions. After your functions, you start implementing your operators. Below your functions, as long as you just don't put the class name here, you just continue like this. You do your operators, operator. Once you are done, then the final question then says, now let's see if you understand how to use your class now. And the main thing to understand is that your class now has these operators overloaded, which means you can now do something like this, or something like this, or something like this. So a typical question like in this case is they can say, hey, there's a file that has holidays for a year, right? And let's say, for instance, this file looks like this. It is a day, space, month, day, space, month, day, space, month for the whole year. So it is holidays. And what we then want you to do is to ask the user to enter a day and check if it's a holiday, which means what you're going to do is the user is going to give you a day, and then you are going to read the file and check if the day the user has given you is part of the holidays listed in the file. Simple scenario. Got that? So the user gives you a day like, 2 April, and you want to check if that day is part of the file, which has a list of all your holidays. So to do that, this is where you then see a combination of file streams being merged together with classes, because under normal, so a typical question would be like this. So let's quickly, here they would say, what do you need to include? We've done file streams, right? And I said we are going to cover file streams together with classes. Now this is it. What 2 things do you include when using file streams? You have to include F stream, and you have to include CSTD lib for your exit function, right? And that's the first thing that you do. Then you use your namespace std as usual. Now your question gets here. So normally they give you like a space, tell us the 2 things that you must include, or sometimes they say it has been done for you. There are different variations of asking these questions, but I'm going to show you everything in one go. And then we can, in the next video, look at a few questions and see the different variations of these questions. But the concept and the logic or the flow, the workflow is just always like this. Okay, so which means we want to read a file, okay, and check if a holiday exists in that file. Or sometimes they can say, if it exists, in this case, we can say display a message on the screen, or whatever. The logic can be different depending on the question. So there's nothing to cram there. I just want you to understand basically how the flow works. So here, we need to declare an input file stream instance. So you can go if stream. You can call this one in file. The next thing you always do is you open it. So you can go in file.open, and we give this our holiday file. So you can go holidays.dat, right? The next thing we do is we check for failure. So you go if in file.fail. Then you can show a message, and then you can exit, right? So you can put your C out if you want. So what we've done now is we've defined an input file stream variable, and we have associated it with our file, right? But remember what we want to do. We want to ask the user to give us a day, which means we do need a variable for a day. So we can declare here, or it might have been declared at the top here. Doesn't matter where it's done, but we can have a day of year variable called day. We can define it here, or we can still define it here. It doesn't matter. And we want the user to give us a day. So we can then say cout, enter a day, right? For instance, I'm going to skip all the other little, let me just write it, cout, enter a day. For instance, we can say to the user, enter a day, right? Which means for us to enter it, for the user to enter a day, we have to remember that we have overloaded the stream extraction operator. So we can simply do something like cin day, which means the compiler will display a cursor for the user to type in a day. They press enter, then it displays another one for the user to type in the month. And that's done, which means after this, the user has given us a day and a month. All right. And you can even put cout statements here, like cout, like enter day, but that won't be necessary really in this case, because we may use a file stream. But anyway, that means you can now enter a day using cin, and we've got a day. Now, what we want to do is we want to now go to the file and read all the days from the file and check if this day is there. So we're going to use our equal or equality operator to check if the day exists in the file. So now how do we read? We use a while loop, right? file streams, remember? So we go while. We can use our EOF function if we want. So we can go in file.eof, which means as long as we are not yet at the end of the file, we're going to keep reading. And then we can say end, which is another way of doing it, end in file. Now we need another day, another variable to store the current day. So we can define another variable here, day of year, and we can call this one current, right? And we can then read into current. So what we have done is day is the one that we got from the user. Current is the one that we are reading from the file, which means every time it goes through your file and it uses your input stream and your operator, what is it doing? It's reading the first thing from the file into day and the second thing into month, because it's reading twice. You see that. Remember, this is an input stream. See, in input file stream, it all works, which means in the file, it's going to read once into day, then again into month, and then it stops. Then in the next while loop, it reads into day, into month. On the next iteration, again into day, into month, until we have reached the end of the file. So we can say, well, let's read our current day. Then in here, we can then say, well, if, right? We can say if our current day is equal to day. And we are free to do this because we have overloaded our equality operator. Then we can say, well, if this is the case, then see out, it's a holiday. Maybe, for instance. And that's it, we are done. And if we want, we can stop looping. So we can then say break to break the loop if we want to make it stop looping, and that's it. Or sometimes they can say it's a holiday, or they can say display the day, which means we can also display the day using cout, because we have overloaded this operator. So we can just display it if we want, or we can just say here, we can say cout, and then we display the day here. And then we say here is a holiday, because we can display with an input, with an insertion operator, and it just works because we have overloaded it. And once we are done, we can then close our file stream there. So basically, this is the logic, which is how they then combine file streams with classes. The logic differs sometimes. They can test a few things. For instance, they can say, well, define a day and give it using the overloaded constructor and give it maybe 01 and 01, which means we don't want you to ask the user to enter a day, just use the one that we gave you, and then check if it's a holiday. So in this case, we are not really asking the user to enter a day, we're just using a predefined day. Or they can give you the variables you must use to instantiate your day. In other words, they are testing your knowledge of using or of instantiating a variable using the overloaded constructor, which is what we discussed in the previous video. If you haven't, please watch it. So there are so many variations as to how then your questions can be structured. But what I wanted to illustrate in this question is this is how they then combine your file streams with your classes, because you are now just using your overloaded operators to carry out some logic. In this case, a very simple program which just tests if a day is a holiday based on days that are listed in a file with days and months, and that's it. So this should give you a brief overview of overloading operators, how you overload those operators, the idea behind friend functions, how to make a function a friend of your class, how to do the actual overloading, and how to then use your instances once your operators have been overloaded. Because if we had not overloaded these operators, we were not going to be able to do something like this or something like this, because it would have complained or something like this. That, well, how do I compare variables of type day of year? It's not possible. But if overloaded, then everything can be done, which means from this point, let's take a look at some of the past exam type questions and see this in an exam context, and just keep practicing from there.